It was a Thursday afternoon in the spring of 1952. The corner of 116th Street and 8th Avenue in Harlem was alive with its usual chaos. Numbers runners weaving between taxicabs, women leaning out of brownstone windows calling their children home, the smell of frying fish drifting from a soul food joint on the ground floor of a crumbling tenement. The jazz clubs hadn't opened yet. The street lights hadn't kicked on. It was that in-between hour in Harlem, the hour when the city held its breath before the night exhaled. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the man every soul in those 32 blocks knew simply as Bumpy, was standing outside Minton's Playhouse on 118th Street. He was impeccably dressed, as always. Navy suit, pressed white shirt, a gray fedora tilted just enough to communicate that he didn't care what you thought. He had a paperback book tucked under his left arm. He was calm, measured, the kind of man who could make silence feel like a verdict. There were perhaps a dozen witnesses on that sidewalk. Regulars, neighborhood men, a couple of women who'd been shopping, a teenager leaning against a wall eating a hot dog. None of them would ever forget what happened in the next 45 seconds. A black sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened. Out stepped a man named Vincent Gigante, a name that would later echo across decades of New York organized crime, but in 1952 was known primarily as an enforcer and rising muscle for the Genovese crime family. Gigante, 24 years old, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, stepped onto the sidewalk like a man who'd been sent somewhere with a specific instruction. The exchange lasted under a minute. Words were spoken, short, sharp, territorial. A warning, a demand. And then, in front of every set of eyes on that sidewalk, Vincent Gigante raised his open hand and struck Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson across the face. The sound traveled. Bumpy didn't fall. He didn't reach for anything. He stood perfectly still for a moment that felt, to every witness, like it lasted an hour. Then he straightened his hat, tucked his book back under his arm, and walked away. He said nothing. The crowd on 116th Street said nothing either. But in the hours that followed, word moved through Harlem the way it always did, quietly, quickly, and with devastating precision. By nightfall, every person of consequence in that neighborhood knew what had happened. By the following morning, men who ran numbers blocks for the Italian families were receiving visitors they hadn't expected. By the end of those 24 hours, a message had been sent that required no words, no weapons, and no announcement. Vincent Gigante's crew, the men who backed him, who organized his operations in Harlem, who collected on his behalf, were on their knees. Not metaphorically, not in some cinematic Hollywood sense. In the very real, very practical way that power resets itself on the streets. Through fear, through consequence, and through the undeniable recognition that they had touched the wrong man. This is the story of why. This is the story of who Bumpy Johnson really was. Not the legend, not the television character, not the mythology, but the actual man. The man who came up from nothing in the most brutalized neighborhood in America. The man who survived Sing Sing twice, who outlasted Lucky Luciano, who negotiated with Vito Genovese as an equal, who fed thousands during the Great Depression, who wrote poetry in prison, and who became, in ways that are still difficult to fully explain, the single most powerful black man in organized crime in American history. And to understand what happened in those 24 hours, you need to go back. You need to go back more than 30 years. You need to go back to a place called Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and a child who was born different and survived because of it. Stay with me, because what follows is not just a crime story. It is a story about power, about dignity, about what happens when a man decides, quietly, completely, and without apology, that he will never be less than what he is. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31st, 1905, in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Halloween. Some people made something of that detail later. Bumpy never seemed to. He was the youngest of 6 children born to William and Georgiana Johnson. The family was working poor in the way that most black families in the Jim Crow South were working poor, meaning they worked constantly and were poor constantly, and the two facts were connected in ways that the people enforcing the system preferred not to discuss. William Johnson worked where he could. Georgiana kept the household and the children together by force of will. What made Ellsworth different from the start was his mind. His teachers noticed it early. He could read before most children his age. He memorized poetry without effort. He had what one childhood acquaintance would later describe as a way of understanding things before they happened, a kind of social intelligence that is difficult to teach and impossible to fake. He also had a serious medical condition, a severe case of eczema and a neurological condition that caused periodic tremors. What some historians believe may have been a form of early-onset essential tremor gave him a physical irregularity that made him a target for boys who didn't know better. He fought back every time, and he won more often than not because he was the biggest, he wasn't, but because he was the most committed. There was something in Bumpy Johnson, even as a child, that did not bend. In 1919, when Ellsworth was 13, his parents made a decision that hundreds of thousands of black Southern families were making during what historians call the Great Migration. They sent their son north, not the whole family at once. His sister, Mabel, was already in New York City, living in a neighborhood that was just then becoming the center of black American cultural life. Harlem. He arrived in New York City in 1919. He was 13 years old. He had a small bag, a letter from his mother, and whatever money Mabel had sent for the train ticket. And Harlem in 1919 was something extraordinary. Between 1910 and 1930, the black population of Harlem grew from approximately 50,000 to more than 200,000 people. Lenox Avenue, 7th Avenue, 125th Street. These were not just streets. They were the arteries of a civilization being built in real time. The Harlem Renaissance was happening. Langston Hughes was writing. Duke Ellington was playing. Marcus Garvey was speaking. Churches were filling. Newspapers were circulating. Black-owned businesses were opening. But alongside the culture was the machinery of survival. Harlem in the 1920s was also controlled, financially, politically, and criminally, almost entirely by forces from outside the neighborhood. The police precincts were staffed and commanded by white officers. The major real estate owners were white. The largest criminal enterprises, particularly the numbers game, were transitioning from black-owned operations to Italian mob control. That transition was not gentle. The numbers game, an illegal lottery where residents bet small amounts on three-digit combinations, was the economic lifeblood of Harlem's underground economy. In the 1920s, the game was run by a network of black entrepreneurs, the most famous of whom was Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madam Queen. St. Clair was a force of nature, a Martinique-born businesswoman who built her operation from the ground up, paid off police, filed legal complaints when necessary, and ran her numbers bank with the organizational discipline of a corporate executive. She employed, at various points, hundreds of Harlem residents. She was a community figure. But by the late 1920s, the Italian families, particularly the organization controlled by Dutch Schultz, an Irish-Jewish gangster allied with the emerging Luciano syndicate, were moving to take over the Harlem numbers trade by force. They approached the black operators with ultimatums. When ultimatums failed, they used violence. Stephanie St. Clair needed help. She found it in a young man who had been making a name for himself on Harlem streets since his mid-teens, a man who had already served time, who had already built a small reputation, and who had something the situation desperately required. He was absolutely unafraid. His name was Bumpy Johnson. He was 22 years old. The name Bumpy came from a bump on the back of his skull, a physical protrusion that people noticed, that he seemed indifferent to, and that became the shorthand by which an entire city would know him for the rest of his life. He never objected to it. He had the self-possession of a man who understood that other people's nicknames for you only hold power if you let them. By the time Stephanie St. Clair brought him into her organization in the late 1920s, Bumpy had already accumulated a street resume that would have impressed men twice his age. He had been arrested multiple times. He had served time at the New York State Reformatory. He had developed relationships throughout Harlem's criminal ecosystem, with numbers runners, with street-level enforcers, with a network of bars and barbershops and social clubs that formed the connective tissue of underground Harlem. But what set him apart was not his record. It was his manner. People who knew Bumpy Johnson consistently described the same quality: a combination of absolute personal dignity, genuine intellectual curiosity, and a capacity for controlled violence that never tipped into recklessness. He read constantly. He could quote Shakespeare and Langston Hughes in the same sentence. He played chess with the seriousness of a competitor and the patience of a strategist. And when violence was required, and in his world, it sometimes was, he applied it with precision, not passion. Stephanie St. Clair recognized immediately what she had found. She made Bumpy Johnson her chief enforcer. His job was simple in theory and complex in practice: to stand between her operation and the expanding Italian mob presence in Harlem, to protect the network, to make consequences real. He was extraordinary at it. The man he would most often find himself in direct conflict with during this period was Dutch Schultz, born Arthur Simon Flegenheimer in 1902, a violent, unpredictable gangster who had taken over large portions of the bootlegging trade during Prohibition and was now turning his attention to the Harlem numbers game with the strategic patience of a predator and the emotional control of a bomb. Schultz did not understand Bumpy Johnson. This was his fundamental mistake. He sent men to deliver warnings. Bumpy received them politely and did nothing. He sent men to collect. They returned without money and, on several occasions, without their dignity intact. He threatened St. Clair's operation directly. The operation continued. The conflict between Schultz and Bumpy Johnson lasted several years and produced a level of tension in Harlem that the newspapers covered intermittently, always with a careful distance, and that the community itself watched with a combination of fear and something close to pride. Here was a black man, operating in a world where black men were expected to step aside, to defer, to accept what the larger white criminal structure decided, who was simply refusing. He was shot multiple times across different incidents. He survived. He walked out of hospitals and back onto the streets with a consistency that began to take on the character of myth. He was arrested repeatedly. The charges ranged from assault to weapons possession to criminal association. Some stuck. He served time at Sing Sing Correctional Facility, the forbidding prison on the Hudson River north of the city that had housed some of the most notorious criminals in American history. He served his time, read his books, and returned. There is a story, reported by multiple sources and consistent across different accounts, of Bumpy Johnson, during his first Sing Sing sentence, giving a lecture on the poetry of Keats to a group of fellow inmates. Whether the details are precisely accurate is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that this story circulated because it was consistent with who people knew him to be. The man who would stand in front of armed Italian mob enforcers was the same man who read Keats. By the early 1930s, the landscape was shifting. Dutch Schultz was increasingly under pressure from federal authorities pursuing tax evasion charges, from the growing power of the Luciano syndicate, and from the accumulating costs of his war with St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson. Something had to give. In 1931, the agreement was reached. The terms were not publicly announced. They were negotiated in the way these arrangements always were, through intermediaries in back rooms, with the understood weight of what happened to people who broke the terms. The Luciano organization, moving to consolidate organized crime under what would become the five-family structure, imposed a settlement. St. Clair would be permitted to maintain a minority stake in her numbers operation, but effective control of the Harlem numbers trade would pass to the Italian families. It was a compromise. It was also, by any honest assessment, a forced arrangement. But Bumpy Johnson remained, and the Italian families, whatever they had taken, understood that in Harlem, they could not operate without him. He was the connection between their investment and the community that generated it. He knew every runner, every banker, every police officer who could be paid, and everyone who couldn't. He was, in the language of the business world that gangsters often echoed, indispensable. So they made him partner. In reality, they gave him an arrangement. He would manage operations in Harlem, take a percentage, and serve as the Italian family's representative in the neighborhood. It was less than what St. Clair had. It was more than what any black man in American organized crime had ever been given. For Bumpy Johnson, it was not an ending. It was a platform. And there was one name that mattered above all others in what came next. One name that would define the 40 years that followed, and that made what happened on that sidewalk in 1952 not just an insult, but a declaration of war. That name was Lucky Luciano. Charles Lucky Luciano was, by the mid-1930s, arguably the most powerful organized crime figure in American history. He had reorganized the Italian-American mob from a collection of warring families into a structured commission. He had survived an assassination attempt that left him with a drooping eyelid and a reputation for near-supernatural resilience. He had built an empire spanning bootlegging, prostitution, numbers, and labor racketeering that generated revenues that dwarfed many legitimate American corporations. He was also, by multiple accounts, a man who respected competence above almost everything else. His relationship with Bumpy Johnson was, by the standards of the era and the industry, remarkable. Luciano and Bumpy had met in the early 1930s during the negotiations that followed the Dutch-Schultz conflict. By all accounts, Luciano came away from that meeting with a view of Bumpy Johnson that few white crime bosses in American history ever held of a black associate. He respected him, not as a useful tool, as an equal. The arrangement that developed between them, formalized in the early and mid-1930s, gave Bumpy effective control of the Harlem numbers trade under the umbrella of what would become the Genovese crime family. He ran his operation independently, maintained his own relationships, managed his own personnel, and reported upward with the kind of professionalism that the Italian families rarely found in their own ranks. In exchange, the family stayed out of the day-to-day operations in Harlem. They took their percentage. Bumpy managed everything else. This arrangement held for years. It held through prohibitions and, through the Depression, through World War II, through the post-war boom. It held because Bumpy Johnson delivered, consistently, professionally, without drama. But by 1946, everything changed. Lucky Luciano, under relentless prosecution by District Attorney Thomas Dewey, was convicted on prostitution charges in 1936 and sentenced to 50 years in prison. He ran his organization from behind bars for nearly a decade. Then, in 1946, in exchange for intelligence support he had allegedly provided to the U.S. government during World War II, assistance with securing the New York docks against Axis sabotage, and helping prepare for the Allied invasion of Sicily. Luciano's sentence was commuted. He was released and immediately deported to Italy. He never returned to American soil. For Bumpy Johnson, Luciano's removal from the American landscape was a seismic event. The man whose personal respect had provided Bumpy's structural protection within the Italian mob framework was gone. What replaced him, what assumed control of the Genovese family structure, was a very different kind of man. Vito Genovese. Born in Naples in 1897, Genovese had fled the United States in 1937 to avoid a murder charge, lived in Italy, returned in 1945, and by the late 1940s was maneuvering to consolidate control of the family that bore his name. He was brilliant, cold, patient, and utterly without the kind of personal respect for competence that had characterized Luciano's leadership style. Where Luciano saw Bumpy Johnson as a valuable independent partner, Genovese saw him as a managed asset. The distinction was not subtle. And beneath Genovese, in the hierarchy that was now the primary Italian mob structure dealing with Harlem, were men who reflected their boss's attitude. Men who saw black operators as employees, not partners. Men who would, when they thought they could get away with it, test boundaries. Men like Vincent Gigante. Now, if you've been with this story from the beginning, if you've understood who Bumpy Johnson was, what he'd survived, what he represented, and what the arrangement that governed his relationship with the Italian families actually meant, then you understand what that slap on 116th Street was really about. It was not a random act of violence. It was a message, a deliberate, calculated, public humiliation designed to communicate one specific thing: that the old arrangement was over, that the respect Luciano had extended was now revoked, that Bumpy Johnson, in the new Genovese family order, would be treated like any other black operator, which is to say, like someone who served at the pleasure of his Italian bosses and could be reminded of that fact whenever necessary. If you found yourself wondering how a man who had survived everything Bumpy Johnson had survived could be reduced to absorbing a public slap without immediate retaliation, if that question has been sitting in your mind since the first minute of this story, then you now have your answer. The question was never whether Bumpy Johnson could fight back. The question was how. If you think Bumpy Johnson walked away from that sidewalk humiliated, you have fundamentally misread the man. He walked away processing. There is a quality in certain exceptional people who have genuinely internalized the difference between reaction and response, that looks to observers like passivity, but is in reality something closer to strategy operating in real time. Bumpy Johnson, standing on that sidewalk in the spring of 1952, was not absorbing an insult. He was calculating a verdict. The slap had happened publicly. That was the point. Gigante had chosen the public setting deliberately, to ensure maximum witness coverage, to make certain that word traveled, to guarantee that the humiliation was social as well as physical. In the hierarchical world of organized crime, a public humiliation that goes unanswered becomes permanent. It recalibrates the power structure. It communicates to everyone watching that the man who was struck occupies a lower position than the man who struck him. This was the intention. But Gigante had made a critical error. He had chosen a public setting without fully understanding what that setting meant. Because Harlem was not Gigante's territory. It was Bumpy Johnson's. Every person on that sidewalk, the women with shopping bags, the teenager with the hot dog, the numbers runners, the regulars outside Minton's, was a node in a network that Bumpy had cultivated over 30 years. Every one of them was connected, within 2 or 3 degrees, to the operational structure that Bumpy managed. And every one of them had just watched something that violated a social contract that had governed Harlem for 2 decades. By 8 o'clock that evening, Bumpy had made 7 visits. The first was to a man named Theodore Teddy Blue Williams, a senior numbers banker who ran operations in the 120th Street corridor and had maintained relationships with both Bumpy's organization and the Genovese line runners. Bumpy sat with him for 20 minutes. He drank coffee. He said very little. But when he left, Teddy Blue made 3 phone calls. The second visit was to a woman named Clair Douglas, not a criminal operative, but a community figure of significant influence, the kind of woman who knew everything and everyone, who ran the church social committee and also knew which police precinct captain could be reached at which hour. She and Bumpy spoke for perhaps half an hour. She nodded often. She said at the end, in a voice that was reported by her nephew decades later, "I'll make sure they understand." What she meant by they covered a range of constituencies. The third, fourth, and fifth visits involved men who were harder to identify by name, operators in the numbers network, some of whom worked directly for Genovese-aligned operations, some of whom had dual relationships. Bumpy's message to each of them was the same, and it was delivered without anger, without threats, and without volume. It was delivered in the manner of a man providing information that others would find useful in making their own decisions. The information was this: that the arrangement under which Harlem operated, the arrangement that had generated millions of dollars for the Italian families for 2 decades, that had kept the neighborhood relatively stable, that had kept the police relationship manageable, that had kept the community from producing the kind of organized resistance that could have made mob operations in Harlem considerably more expensive, that arrangement was contingent on mutual respect, and that mutual respect had just been publicly violated. He did not say what would happen next. He didn't need to. The sixth visit, near midnight, was the one that mattered most strategically. It was to a man named Joseph Joe Strettrow, a Genovese family capo who had been one of the primary Italian mob contacts for Harlem operations since the early 1940s. Rao was a careful man, a practical man, a man who understood the numbers not just in the criminal sense, but in the mathematical sense. He understood costs and revenues and margins. He understood that Harlem, as an operational territory, generated approximately 40% of the family's numbers income in New York City. He understood what losing that territory, or even meaningfully disrupting it, would cost. Bumpy sat across from him in a private back room and explained calmly and completely what had happened that afternoon. He described Gigante's actions. He described the witnesses. He described the social consequences currently spreading through the neighborhood. And then he laid out, with the precision of a man who had been thinking about this moment for the previous 12 hours, exactly what those social consequences would mean for operations. Numbers runners who had worked under Italian management for years were, as of tonight, uncertain of their loyalty. Police contacts who had operated on the assumption of stability were now receiving questions from community figures who had witnessed the public humiliation of the man those contacts had dealt with for 2 decades. The network of relationships that made Harlem a profitable territory was, at this precise moment, vibrating in ways that would become structurally damaging within 48 to 72 hours if nothing changed. Rao listened. He did not argue. He was a practical man. The 7th visit, the one that completed the sequence, was not a visit at all. It was a phone call placed from a payphone on Lenox Avenue at approximately 2 in the morning. The details of that call are not recorded in any public document. But what followed from it is, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know we go deep on these stories. Not because crime is something to celebrate, but because the history of power, survival, and human dignity in places like Harlem deserves to be told completely and honestly. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing. The next story we're covering goes somewhere even fewer people talk about, and it starts with a phone call that was never supposed to happen. By 8 o'clock the following morning, 3 men appeared at Bumpy Johnson's door on 118th Street. They were not men Bumpy had summoned. They came because they had been sent. They were members of Vincent Gigante's immediate crew, the men who had backed him, who ran his errands, who served as his operational support in the Italian mob's Harlem-adjacent activities. 2 of them had almost certainly been present the previous afternoon. All 3 of them arrived without weapons, without threats, and without the swagger that had characterized the interactions between Genovese-aligned personnel and Bumpy's people in recent months. What they came to deliver was a message from higher up the chain. The message was not delivered in words that have been publicly recorded, but its substance, inferred from everything that followed, was clear. The incident the previous day had been unauthorized, had not represented the position of the organization's senior leadership, and would not recur. Gigante had acted outside his mandate. The arrangement that governed Harlem operations would be maintained as previously structured. The respect that characterized interactions between the family and Bumpy Johnson's organization would be restored. In plain language, they begged for mercy, not in tears, not on their knees in any literal theatrical sense, but in the only way that matters in that world, by showing up without posturing at the door of the man they had humiliated the previous day and asking him to let it go. Bumpy let it go, but he let it go on his terms, and everyone in that room understood the terms. And Gigante, who would go on, decades later, to lead the Genovese family himself, to fake mental illness for 30 years to avoid prosecution, to become one of the most powerful and cunning crime bosses in American history, never in any recorded account made the same mistake twice with Bumpy Johnson. Here is what the mythology of Bumpy Johnson almost always omits. He fed people. During the Great Depression, when Harlem's already battered economy collapsed entirely, when men who had built lives in the neighborhood were standing in bread lines, when children were going to school without having eaten, when families were being evicted from apartments by landlords who remained indifferent to human suffering, Bumpy Johnson organized food distributions throughout the community. This was not charity in the traditional sense. He didn't set up a formal organization or apply for a status. He used his operational network, the same network that ran numbers, that managed the criminal infrastructure of the neighborhood, to procure food, organize distribution, and get meals to families that had nothing. He did it consistently, without announcement, and without seeking recognition. There are documented accounts in the archives of the Amsterdam News, Harlem's major black newspaper, which covered community activities throughout the 1930s, of Johnson's food distributions reaching hundreds of families during the worst years of the Depression. These were not one-time events. They were systematic. When the New York City Housing Authority began evicting black families from tenements for failure to pay rent during the Depression years, Bumpy Johnson organized resistance. Not criminal resistance, organized community resistance. He would appear at evictions, sometimes with men who created enough physical friction to delay the process, sometimes with cash to pay what was owed, sometimes simply with the weight of his presence and reputation, which was enough to make landlords reconsider the speed of their actions. He also had a relationship with the law, or rather, a specific and complicated relationship with specific law enforcement figures that defied the simple narrative of criminal versus police. Captain Joseph Gallagher of the 28th Precinct, who covered much of the neighborhood in the 1940s and early 1950s, reportedly maintained what multiple accounts describe as a working relationship with Bumpy Johnson. Not a corrupt relationship, but the kind of pragmatic accommodation that characterized policing in high-crime, under-resourced neighborhoods throughout American history. Gallagher understood that Bumpy Johnson's presence in Harlem was, in certain specific ways, stabilizing. The number of random violent crimes in the blocks where Johnson had direct influence was measurably lower than in comparable areas. The community's willingness to cooperate with police investigations, always a challenge in heavily policed black neighborhoods, was higher in Johnson's territory than outside it. This is not to romanticize organized crime. It is to describe, honestly, what existed. Bumpy Johnson also corresponded with politicians. Letters in various archives, some published in partial form in historical accounts of the period, showed Johnson writing to New York City council members about housing conditions in Harlem, about police conduct, about the quality of schools. The letters are articulate, specific, and notably free of any criminal association or implicit threat. They read like the letters of a civic-minded citizen. He wrote poetry. This is perhaps the detail that most comprehensively disrupts the simple narrative. During his two significant periods of incarceration, including his time at Sing Sing in the 1940s, Johnson wrote poetry that was, by accounts of people who read it, genuinely accomplished. Not amateur prison verse. Poetry that engaged with classical forms, that showed the influence of Keats and Langston Hughes and Claude McKay. Poetry that his wife, Mamie Hatcher Johnson, preserved and that she spoke about publicly after his death. Mamie Hatcher Johnson deserves more than a footnote in this story. They married in 1948 after years of what can only be described as a complicated courtship, complicated by his incarceration, by the nature of his work, by the social gulf between a woman of her background. She was educated, socially respectable, from a family that had built itself carefully in the black middle class, and a man of his. She loved him without apology. She managed his household, managed his public relationships, and provided, by every account that survives, a kind of stable personal center that Bumpy Johnson, for all his extraordinary capabilities, genuinely needed. She was also, in her own quiet way, brilliant. After his death, she became an important keeper of his memory and a voice against the simplified mythologies that gangster culture tends to accumulate around figures like her husband. In a 1988 interview, years after Bumpy's death, Mamie Johnson said, People want him to be what they need him to be. They want him to be a gangster, pure and simple. Or they want him to be a community hero, pure and simple. He was a man, a complicated man who lived in a complicated time and did what he did for reasons that made sense to him and that I understood, even when I didn't always agree. This is the closest thing to a definitive statement about Bumpy Johnson that exists. It deserves to be held in mind for everything that follows. By the mid-1950s, Harlem was changing. The heroin epidemic, which would devastate black communities across urban America throughout the 1950s and 1960s, was beginning its catastrophic work. The numbers game was under increasing federal pressure. The Italian families, navigating their own internal power struggles, were less stable partners. The generation of men who had built the underground infrastructure of Harlem was aging. Bumpy Johnson served a second significant period of incarceration in the late 1950s and early 1960s, a federal narcotics conviction that sent him to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta from 1956 to 1963. This was a charge he contested, arguing that he had been specifically targeted by federal law enforcement as part of a broader effort to dismantle the Harlem criminal infrastructure. Federal prosecutors argued that his operation had intersected with heroin distribution networks, even if he was not a primary distributor himself. The truth of this, like much about Bumpy Johnson's later career, remains contested. What is known is that he emerged from federal prison in 1963 at the age of 57, returned to Harlem, and found a neighborhood that had been transformed in ways that were, by any measure, tragic. The heroin epidemic had done to Harlem what decades of organized criminal activity, systematic poverty, and housing discrimination had not quite managed. It had hollowed out the community's social fabric at the most intimate level. Families were being destroyed. The generation that had grown up in the 1940s and early 1950s, children who had played in the same streets that Bumpy had patrolled for 30 years, were dying. The numbers game was still operating, but the structure that had given it a kind of predictable, manageable character was fracturing. Bumpy Johnson was deeply opposed to heroin. This is not a redeemed gangster narrative device. It is documented. Multiple people who knew him in his later years, including people whose accounts are preserved in historical interviews conducted by researchers, describe his consistent, sometimes fierce opposition to heroin trafficking in his territory. He is reported to have said, on multiple occasions, that numbers was a game that hurt nobody seriously, but heroin was something different, something that destroyed the very community he operated within. Whether this position was purely moral or also strategic, whether he recognized that a community consumed by heroin was a community that couldn't run numbers, couldn't sustain the commercial ecosystem that made organized crime profitable, is something historians continue to debate. Possibly both were true. By the mid-1960s, a young man from Harlem had come to Bumpy Johnson's attention. His name was Frank Lucas. He was ambitious, practical, and learning the streets with the focused intensity of someone who intended to surpass everyone around him. Multiple accounts describe a relationship between Lucas and Johnson in Johnson's later years. Not a formal mentorship exactly, but something in that direction. Johnson apparently recognized in Lucas a quality he understood from the inside. Frank Lucas would go on, after Johnson's death, to build one of the most significant heroin distribution operations in New York City history. The irony that the man who had opposed heroin may have inadvertently helped form the man who would flood Harlem with it is the kind of tragic historical echo that doesn't resolve itself into a lesson. It just sits there. On July 7, 1968, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was sitting in a restaurant in Harlem called Wells Restaurant, a well-known establishment on 7th Avenue that served soul food and was a regular gathering place for Harlem's professional class. He was 62 years old. He had been out of federal prison for 5 years. He had spent those years trying, with mixed success, to maintain relevance in a neighborhood that was changing faster than any neighborhood he had ever known. He was sitting with friends, eating, talking. By multiple accounts, he was laughing at something when it happened. He suffered a massive heart attack. He was taken to Harlem Hospital. He died there on July 7th, 1968, surrounded by a city that had shaped him and that he, in ways large and small, had shaped in return. He was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, the same cemetery that holds, among others, Duke Ellington and Miles Davis. He was given a funeral that drew, by press estimates, several thousand mourners, community members, former associates, politicians, ordinary Harlem residents who had benefited from his food distributions 30 years earlier or had simply grown up knowing his name as a fixture of the neighborhood's identity. Mamie Johnson wore black and received condolences with the dignity of a woman who had spent 20 years preparing herself for this possibility and still found it difficult. The mythology of Bumpy Johnson did not begin after his death. It was always there, operating in parallel with the reality. And after his death, it accelerated. He was the basis for the character Harlem Kingpin Bumpy in a 1971 film, The French Connection, and its sequel. He appeared as a character in multiple works of crime fiction. He was portrayed in the film American Gangster, the 2007 Ridley Scott film starring Denzel Washington and Russell Crowe, with Clarence Williams III giving what many viewers considered the most authoritative screen interpretation of his presence and manner. The television series Godfather of Harlem, which premiered in 2019 and starred Forrest Whitaker in the lead role, gave him the most extended fictional treatment to date, dramatizing, with considerable creative liberty, aspects of his life that the historical record only partially illuminates. These portrayals have kept his name alive. They have also, inevitably, simplified him. What the mythology tends to omit is the poetry, the food distributions, the letters to city council members, the chess games, the Keats, the Mamie. What the mythology tends to emphasize is the power, the confrontations, the survival. These things are real and worth emphasizing, but they're not the whole person. Stephanie St. Clair, the woman who had first recognized what Bumpy Johnson was and had given him his first significant platform, outlived him by several years. She died in 1969, 1 year after him. In her later years, she made a point of saying publicly that among all the people she had ever worked with, Bumpy Johnson had been the only one she trusted completely. Not feared, not depended on, trusted. That distinction between fear and trust is perhaps the most important thing you can understand about what Bumpy Johnson actually was. Let's go back one final time to 116th Street. Spring 1952. The slap. What you now understand, having come this far through this story, is that the slap was not a victory for Gigante. It was a miscalculation so complete that it revealed, by contrast, exactly how much structural power Bumpy Johnson actually held. Gigante had counted on the fact that public humiliation, unanswered, would recalibrate the power balance in his favor. What he had failed to calculate was that Bumpy Johnson's power did not live in his physical posture on a sidewalk. It lived in 30 years of relationships, in a network so dense and so loyal that a single night of quiet conversations could move more weight than any open display of violence. Gigante had the physical. Bumpy had the architecture, and the architecture, in the end, always wins. The 24 hours between the slap and the visit from Gigante's crew were not hours of humiliation. They were hours of consolidation. Every conversation Bumpy had that night was a thread being pulled tighter. Every person he visited was a node in a network being activated. By the time Gigante's men appeared at his door the following morning, they were not visiting a man who had been beaten. They were visiting a man who had, in the preceding 16 hours, demonstrated more operational control over Harlem than Gigante had ever understood him to possess. They came because they had been told to come. They had been told to come because people considerably above Gigante in the organizational hierarchy had run a very simple calculation. The cost of losing or disrupting Harlem operations was greater than the cost of whatever message Gigante had been trying to send. Bumpy Johnson had never thrown a punch. He had never made a threat. He had simply made the cost of the alternative visible. This is power, not performance, not violence. Power. There's a question worth sitting with at the end of this story. What does it mean to be powerful in a system designed to deny you power? Bumpy Johnson spent his entire adult life operating within a criminal structure that was itself a response to a legitimate economic and social structure that excluded him and the community he came from. The numbers game existed because black people in Harlem in the 1920s and 1930s did not have equal access to banks, to investment markets, to the legitimate wealth-building mechanisms that white Americans took for granted. The underground economy was, in part, a parallel economy built by necessity. Bumpy Johnson was not a hero in any uncomplicated sense. He was a criminal by law, clearly, and by the standards of the community that also depended on him and mourned him more ambiguously. He caused harm and prevented harm, often in the same breath. He fed children and managed organizations that took money from the same families. He opposed heroin and may have helped shape the man who would distribute it. He was, as Mamie Johnson said, a complicated man who lived in a complicated time. But in the specific narrow question of what happened between a Thursday afternoon in spring 1952 and the following morning, in the question of how a man responds to public humiliation without violence, without posturing, without self-destruction, Bumpy Johnson demonstrated something that deserves to be understood regardless of what you think of the world he inhabited. He demonstrated that the deepest power is structural, not performative. That 30 years of relationships cannot be undone by 45 seconds of aggression. That a man who truly understands his own position has no reason to perform outrage, because the mechanism of consequence does not require his emotion to operate. He walked away from that slap. He walked home. He made 7 quiet visits. And by morning, the men who had sent a message were learning what messages cost. There are things you cannot understand about Harlem in the mid-20th century without understanding Bumpy Johnson. There are things you cannot understand about power, real power, structural power, power that lives in relationships and reputation and 30 years of consistent behavior, without understanding what happened in those 24 hours. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson died on July 7th, 1968, in a Harlem restaurant, laughing. He was 62 years old. He had lived, by any measure, 100 years in those 62. And on the streets of Harlem, where his name has never fully disappeared, where people still speak it with a specific weight reserved for those who did something real in a world that tried to make them nothing, the story is still told. The slap heard across Harlem, and the 24 hours that followed.